This is A Different Perspective with Kevin Randle. A retired U.S. Lieutenant Colonel, Kevin Randle has been studying UFOs for nearly 50 years. Kevin has investigated some of the most famous UFO cases in the world and has been consulted for dozens of documentaries about UFOs. Considered one of the leading experts into the Roswell UFO crash of 1947, Kevin has written more than 25 books about UFOs, including the recently published Roswell in the 21st Century. Now, here is the host of A Different Perspective, Kevin Randle.
And welcome to what I think of as Season 6 of A Different Perspective. I am Kevin Randle. I thought we'd begin with just a bit of an explanation of why I've been away from the microphone for so long. I've had a number of personal crises, maybe. Not really problems, it's more crises oriented, that took up a lot of my time and energy and things like that. And those, for the most part, have been resolved. For those of you who are interested in what some of that is, if you go to my blog, kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and look for around April 20th of last year, and you'll see some of the reasons that I have been away from the microphone for so long. And some of that continued into this year. As just a personal anecdote about, I guess, my luck in the last few months, we had a major snowstorm, and we hadn't had one for a long time, in about the middle of January. And I went outside to do the snow shoveling, and I went to brush the snow off the top of my mailbox, which sits on a post, of course, and the mailbox fell into the snow. You know, just sort of an example of the little things that were piling up on me. And I'm sitting there thinking, what can I do? I can't get a new pole, can't get a new mailbox because we've got 12 inches of snow on the ground and the ground is frozen. And remembering Mythbusters, I got out my duct tape and taped it back together. And believe it or not, it actually works. And I think it's stronger than it was before. So it's just kind of a way of explaining that a lot of little things were piling up and there were some major things that were going on as well. So that's why I've been away from the microphone for so long. But during that time, I, of course, was paying attention to what was going on in the world of UFOs because it's changed radically in the last couple of years. I know we had the articles from the New York Times by Leslie Kean and I think Ralph Blumenthal about the Navy encounters with unidentified flying objects, which I guess we called them at the time, and we've now moved them to something else. And how that kind of sparked a renewed interest in UFOs. And it suggested that Congress was interested in what was going on and that sort of thing. So I've been keeping up with that. I've sat through the congressional hearings that were televised, the NASA briefing that seemed to last forever with everybody saying absolutely nothing. And that's kind of the whole trend here. If you have watched any of these briefings, have watched any of these interrogations of people in front of the Senate committees, what you find is they say virtually nothing. It's all about, well, what we're going to do is this. What we're going to try to find is this. This is how we're going to operate. Nothing about what they're actually getting in the way of evidence or cases or sightings, which is, I think, what most of us wanted to know about. Is there anything special about it? I know that some of the Navy sightings, the cockpit videos that kind of launched this, were more technological glitches than anything else. There was a YouTube video I found at the time, and I think I've mentioned it before, where a guy connected night vision goggles to his cell phone and turned it on, and he got a pyramid-shaped object that was spinning. And that was one of the things that the Navy had let loose, set out. I didn't want to say declassified. I don't know if it was ever classified, but released into the public arena. And it matched, and that seemed to explain part of the problem. Yet you have to remember that there were other electronic sensors involved. There were sightings by people, which of course was not explained by those technological glitches, but it caused an awful lot of interest in what was going on in the UFOs. So while I was on my long sabbatical, that was also hampered, by the way, and I'm going to digress for a moment here because it just popped in my head. I got an email from a publisher wanting to republish some of the action adventure books that Bob Cornett and I had written in the 1980s. And that took up time getting all of that set up. And I've actually written 2 more of those books to add to that collection. And since they were offering actual cash money to do this, I felt somewhat of an obligation to do so. If you're interested in those books, if you go to my blog, kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and you scroll down the books on the left side, you'll find a book by Eric Helm. I am Eric Helm in that arena. So you can take a look at those books. Most of them deal with the Vietnam War. One of them, Chopper Pilot in the Wings Over Nam series. If you were in the 116th Assault Helicopter Company back in 1968, you'd recognize some of the things that I describe in that book. So I've been doing that sort of thing. I've also been doing additional UFO books. I did one called Understanding Roswell, which was a look at an awful lot of the material that had gone on and what is, I guess, more current. There's always been discussion of what happened to the people who were involved in 1947, especially the higher ranking officers who would have been directly involved in the investigation. And I looked into the background of some of those people, and they had some fascinating experiences. Lieutenant Colonel Payne, I believe it was involved in the Korean War, and he was testing a new type of bomb that detonated prematurely and blew up the aircraft. So he was killed. He was killed during the Korean War. And one of the guys named Nero, I believe it was, they were talking about how he had disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle. Well, it's not exactly true, but he was on an airplane with a bunch of other people from the 509th Bomb Group, those being the guys in Roswell. And it went down in the Atlantic Ocean. They made a distress call. There was an overflight where they found the wreckage and people in life rafts. And by the time they could get a ship there, everything had disappeared. So we're not sure what happened to him, but other than the plane crashed, I guess. So I was keeping up with what was going on in the UFO community at the time while I was on this long hiatus. But I didn't have a lot of time to write about these things. So there's been long gaps in what I've posted to the blog and long gaps in what I've published in other arenas. But I've tried to keep up what was going on so that when I had the opportunity to come back, and I need to thank Rob McConnell and the X Zone for keeping my spot open, I suppose, so that I could come back and talk about the UFOs. So I was busy doing these sorts of things. And as I say, it's been a complicated 18 months to 2 years with things going on in the background that prohibited me from getting into the UFO, well, I guess, mainstream as much as I wanted to. I turned down any number of opportunities to go out on the lecture service. I had to turn them down, and I kind of regret this one. I could have had a trip to Brazil to talk about UFOs, but at the time I was not able to leave home. I needed to stay around the house and take care of things here. So I couldn't do that. I was invited to any other number of conferences, and I couldn't make it. So I kept my hand in by trying to talk about things on the blog and writing additional books. I'm going to update the Roswell Encyclopedia for those of you who are interested, because some of the entries now are obsolete. Now, there's a long entry on Gerald Anderson, for example, the guy who claimed as a 5-year-old kid he was on the crash site with Bonnie Barnett. And I think it's pretty well clear that that story was not credible. And so his entry is going to be reduced to a footnote. And it's the same with Frank Kaufman, who I know Don and I thought was providing some good information about that, but we had to reevaluate that as we learned more about what his real background was and who he really was and that sort of thing. So I update the Roswell Encyclopedia, adding some new stuff to it that we've just found recently, and taking out some of the things or reducing them to footnotes, the stuff that we probably not relevant to the case anymore. So that's kind of what I've been doing for the last few months. And of course, watching the creation of APRO, the All Domain Anomalous Research Office or Organization, I just think of it as ARROW because they've come up with this complicated name. I mean, Project Blue Book was easy to remember, and Project Moondust was easy to remember. Now we've got these complicated names that try to incorporate everything, and they change the acronyms and all of that. I think it's kind of a way of moving us away from the old and looking just at the new, so they don't have to worry about what had gone on in the past. And I always thought that was a bad idea, because there's good cases from the past, and that we could look at those sorts of things, and we could learn some things about what had happened back then, even though we're talking about things that may have happened in 1947 or 1952 or 1957. There's good documentation out there. Any number of private organizations were reviewing these cases. There's the newspaper articles, there's archives, there's the Project Blue Book files, which we all now have access to through the internet. So we could look at these things and sort of see the way those investigations were going. So they originally weren't going to do any of that sort of stuff. Avi Loeb, the Harvard astrophysicist who talked about the alien artifact that passed through the solar system several years ago, I talked to him about that, and I know when he was on this program a number of years ago as well, and I think he was getting a little hot under the collar when I was kind of talking to him about, well, you need to look at the history. You need to understand the history of the UFO phenomena if you're going to move into it. You want to talk about the astronomical aspect, which you're into right now. That's all well and good, but there are other components that may impact on what you are saying and what you believe. So I noticed that there was an attempt to divest themselves of the earlier history of the UFO phenomenon, and that part of that was working, I think, against them, because there was good information out there and give them an idea of what was going on. They wanted to talk about anecdotal evidence in the form of witness testimony, for example. And yeah, it's anecdotal if you've got one guy, but if you've got several guys and you've got pilots and you've got radar and you've got other sorts of instrumentality involved, then it's really not all that anecdotal, and it moves into the realm of empirical evidence. And I think that's an important thing to distinguish in the scientific research. They want empirical evidence, but some of that empirical evidence does involve what they now classify as anecdotal, as a way of dismissing it as not being real. So that's kind of where I have been for the last 18 months, 2 years. When we come back, I'm going to talk a little bit more about ARROW and the current investigations and how that is affecting UFO research and where we need to go on that. So I will be back in just a few minutes, so stick around and we'll learn a little bit more about the UFO field.
Are you ready to dive into the mysteries of the unknown? Tune into the electrifying X-Zone radio TV show hosted by the one and only Rob McConnell.
I'm Rob McConnell, and get ready for a mind-bending journey through the unexplained phenomenon that surrounds us all. From UFO encounters to cryptids, ghosts, and everything in between, we've got it covered here in the X-Zone.
Rob McConnell, the seasoned investigator and renowned radio personality, brings you the most compelling interviews with top experts, authors, and experiencers from around the world. Each episode is an unforgettable exploration into the depths of the extraordinary.
That's right, X-Zone Nation. Join me every week as we open the door to the supernatural and explore the strange and amazing stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.
And it's not just radio anymore. With our groundbreaking TV show, you can now witness the sessions unfold right before your eyes. From chilling reenactments to captivating visuals, prepare yourself for a multimedia experience like never before.
With a legacy spanning over 2 decades, the X-Zone Radio and TV show with yours truly, Rob McConnell, is your ultimate source for mind-blowing entertainment and thought-provoking discussions. Join our growing community of truth seekers as we continue to unlock the world's mysteries.
So, why wait? Step into the X Zone and embark on a journey that will challenge your beliefs, ignite your curiosity, and keep you on the edge of your seat.
Remember, X-Zone Nation, the truth is out there, and it's waiting for you right here on the X-Zone Radio and TV show with yours truly, Rob McConnell. Don't miss a minute of the action.
Tune in now on your favorite radio station or visit xzoneradiotv.com to join the adventure. The X Zone Radio TV show with Rob McConnell, where reality meets the unknown.
The X Zone Radio TV show, unraveling the secrets of the universe, one episode at a time. For more information, visit www.xzoneradiotv.com.
And we are back. When we went away, I was kind of moving into the history of some of this latest investigation and how the initial ideas for the investigations were to reject or ignore the history of the UFO phenomenon. And a great deal of the history of the UFO phenomenon is filled with misidentifications and hoaxes and things that really didn't belong in UFO research, more paranormal activity than ufological activity. But there were good things going on there. One of the first things that I watched was a congressional hearing when they had two people from the Pentagon and the Department of the Navy talking about what was going on in the way of research. And it was pretty ridiculous. The video they showed was short. It wasn't really clear as to what was going on there and could have been practically anything. And I'll take a moment to go back a little bit. Back in 1948, there was a UFO sighting by two airline pilots, Charles and Whitted. And I think they were both former military pilots as well. And they saw what they described as a cigar-shaped object coming toward their aircraft at 5,000 feet, had square windows and a lighted cockpit, and it flashed by them at high speed. And initially, I think Jill and Hynek identified it as a meteor, but later on it was listed as unidentified. When the Air Force prepared their estimate of the situation, one of the cases that kind of inspired that work was the Charles Whitted case from 1948. In 1968, the Zond 4, which was I think Soviet spacecraft, re-entered the atmosphere and broke up. People all over the country saw it. What was interesting is while most people realized what they were looking at, there were any number of people who said it was a cigar-shaped craft with square windows and a lighted cockpit. And the illustrations they made resembled that of Charles Whitted. The point being that they were not lying about what they had seen. They misinterpreted the sighting, what they were actually seeing. I found on YouTube a number of videos. One of them was called Meteor Compilation. I was trying to think it was a meteorite. So it's 3 minutes and some seconds long, and it was a compilation of videos of meteors. And what struck me was as you watch some of these, you could see as the meteor broke up, it would string out bits of fiery debris behind it, and it looked for all the world like a lighted cockpit and windows. And some people for the Zond 4 reentry, and we know what it was, saw the same thing. And I got to thinking, this looks an awful lot like the Charles Whitted sighting as well. Jerry Clark and I argued about this a little bit, and I shouldn't say argued, just discussed it. He believes it was a bolide, a very bright meteor. I think it was, or a cigar-shaped craft. I think it was a bolide, a very bright meteor. So when we see these things, and especially if we see them quickly, and it's kind of suggested to me that if you have a sighting that lasts less than a minute, the witnesses probably didn't get a real good look at what was coming down. And they could misperceive the breakup of the craft, meaning a like re-entering spacecraft, a Soviet spacecraft or an American spacecraft, one of our terrestrially based spacecraft, I guess you should say, then there's a good chance they misinterpreted the mind filled in details for them. And I believe that that's what happened with Child's Witness. So they're reporting as accurately as they could what they saw. And their descriptions were gathered within literally hours of the sighting. So you were getting fresh information from them, but it was their interpretation of what they had seen. And if you look at the drawings, they don't look quite the same. There's a little enough, I guess, differences between the two that it might suggest it was not a structured craft, but was in fact a meteor breaking up. So I looked at all of that sort of thing and decided, yeah, that's kind of where we are. So there are good cases that we resolve in the modern world based on better information that we have. And had it not been for that meteor or meteorite compilation, I'm not sure I would have ever made the connection there. But there you have it. So the point is you need to look at that, but that's kind of the stuff we would stay away from. There are other cases. I will mention Roswell. Everybody agrees something fell. It's just a question of the interpretation of what it was. Would be a case that I think as a historical reference you'd need to look at. I think of the Washington National sightings in 1952, where the objects were seen on multiple radars, were seen by both civilian and military pilots who attempted an intercept. They were seen by people on the ground, was witnessed by people in the control towers at the airports. I think that's a very good sighting. The Air Force wrote it off as temperature inversions, but given the circumstances and the weather, that probably is not a legitimate explanation. And I could move on to Levelland in 1957, where we have the same thing. Multiple witnesses, including police officers, including sheriff's deputies, including lots of civilian witnesses. And I believe Air Force officers were involved. Although the Air Force officers' role, I guess, dropped out early on. I found a couple of references to Air Force officers working with the sheriff in Levelland on the night of the sightings. And what happened was the sheriff went out to look for the object. In the Air Force files, it talks about a streak of red in the distance. Prior to the Air Force investigation, the sheriff had told others that he saw a football-shaped or oval-shaped object that was bright red. And later he told Don Berliner, and I'm thinking 1975, so it's quite a bit later, about that. In the meantime, he talked to an Air Force investigator, and what they talked about was this streak of light, and it was written off as pulp ball lightning. Took me a minute to remember what it was written off as because it's such a ridiculous explanation. But the point is the sheriff went out and looked for the object, and he apparently found it. Behind him was a car driven by the Texas Department of Public Safety, which I believe it was called that at the time. That's basically the state police. And behind them was a car with Air Force officers in it. I found just one reference to that. The interesting thing is that there's nothing in the Project Blue Book files about Air Force officers being involved, although the local law enforcement did, in fact, contact Reese Air Force Base, which is in Lubbock. It's 15, 20 minutes away from Levelland. But the other interesting thing is Don Burlinson did an investigation, and he was talking to the mechanic for the sheriff's office. The guy was the mechanic back in 1957, and told him that the day after the sightings, which would have been November 3rd, the sheriff brought his car into the shop to have it checked. And I can think of no reason for him to do that unless his car was stalled. Seeing if there was a mechanical reason for the car stalling, looking for something that would have stalled the car's engine. But if he was close enough for the object to stall his car engine, it stalled the car engine of the state police, and it stalled the car engine of the Air Force officers. Well, the Air Force couldn't have you questioning Air Force officers about this, would require them to have lied about this sort of thing. So these sorts of cases that have been explained, and Levelland, for those of you who are interested, was explained as ball lightning. And anybody knows that in 1957, there was a big argument whether ball lightning even existed. I think the consensus in today's environment is it does exist, but there's still a controversy about it. The ball lightning is usually something that is 12 to 14 to 24 inches in diameter and is very short-lived. the object described by various witnesses, people who saw it. One guy, it landed close to him, and he sat there looking at it for 5 minutes, and they described it as something much larger than ball lightning. So the Air Force explanation simply doesn't work. The Air Force said there were only 3 witnesses to the object. If you go through the files, you can find the names of others who saw an object, and you can find the names of many people whose car engines were stalled at close approach. And there's also a report that the sheriff found a burned area, a circular burned area, or one of the ranchers told the sheriff about a burned area. So you have a case where you have the UFO interacting with the environment. You have multiple witnesses, including law enforcement officers at various levels of the law enforcement hierarchy. You had Air Force officers who were witnesses, and you have physical evidence on the ground in the form of a landing trace. Think what we might have learned had that case been investigated properly in 1957, rather than the Air Force arguing with Don Kehoe. Yeah, there's a lot of Dons in that case. Don Kehoe was the director of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, about the number of witnesses, not what they saw, not how it played out, the number of people who saw it. I think Kehoe said there were 9. The Air Force said there were 3. In the Air Force files, I found the names of 13. And by going through newspapers and other archival material, I found the names of many, many more people than that. The point simply is the initial investigation, starting after the Navy released the cockpit videos, or the cockpit videos were released. They were only going to look at that sort of stuff. They weren't going to delve into the history of the UFO phenomenon. I think they wanted to do that because of cases like Levelland and the Washington Nationals, and several other cases in that time frame. They relied on the Condon Committee. That was the University of Colorado study, the scientific investigation of unidentified flying objects. And the problem there is the conclusions were written out and given to the Condon Committee prior to a single investigation being started. And again, that information is on my blog, including the letter from Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hippler. I keep wanting to call him George. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hippler to Dr. Robert Lowe of the Condon Committee. And Hippler says in this letter, and a copy of the letter is on my blog, said, here's what we would like you to find: that the Air Force did a good job investigating, that there is no reason to continue to investigation because nothing of scientific value can be learned, and that the Air Force had done a good job, but there were no national security issues. And that's exactly what they found. Condon was giving a lecture in Corning, New York, and while he was making his presentation, he said, and it's reported in the newspapers, that I'm pretty well satisfied with what's going on here. There's nothing to it, but I'm not supposed to come to that conclusion for another 18 months. So they look at that sort of thing and they don't get any deeper into it. And the point is that first investigation, the people being interrogated by Congress didn't seem to know what was going on. One of the congressional members, and this surprised me, began to talk to him about the sightings at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967. There were sightings in Belt, Montana, and Malmstrom's right near Belt, Montana, and Malmstrom has a great missile field scattered over literally hundreds of square miles of Montana. And one of the congressmen brought that up because there was a national security implication in it, and the information had been withheld. And that national security implication rightly should have been withheld given the information. But the congressman knew about it, and he asked those guys about what happened there. And they said, well, we've never heard of that. We don't know anything about that. Later on in that investigation, one of the men said, yeah, he knew vaguely about Malmstrom Air Force Base. How can you conduct a complete investigation of the history of the UFO phenomena when you're overlooking evidence like that? It's important to understand the history so you can move on from there. I will continue in this vein in just a moment. And I think we're going to talk about David Grush and his UFO crashes and what we learned about that. So I will be back right after this, so please stick around.
Are you ready for a tale that will leave you on the edge of your seat? Get ready to dive into the gripping memoir by Bart Sibrel titled Moon Man. Bart Sibrel takes you on a heart-pounding journey, unmasking the truth behind America's famous Apollo missions. Prepare yourself for hair-raising encounters with agents from the U.S. government's top secret agencies. In Moonman, Sibrel fearlessly reveals his real-life espionage adventures, shining a light on one of the CIA's best-kept secrets. Brace yourself for shocking revelations, including Sibrel's discovery of privately recorded audio exposing an Apollo astronaut's chilling plot, a plot orchestrated by the CIA. That's right. As Sibrel unveils this groundbreaking evidence, it becomes clear that there is much more to the Apollo missions than meets the eye. Could it be that we've been deceived all along? Moonman is a gripping page-turner that challenges everything you thought you knew. It's a mind-bending journey into the unknown, where the line between truth and fiction becomes blurred. Don't miss this opportunity to uncover the secrets hidden for decades. Let your curiosity guide you as you join Bart Sibrel on his quest to find the truth. Moonman, available now at Sibrel.com. That's Sibrel.com. Prepare to have your beliefs shaken to the very core.
And I am back. We were talking a little bit about the APRO investigation and the current state of investigations, and I was explaining how some of that investigation wasn't very good. The recent investigation weren't very good, with the people involved in the investigations not knowing about some of the classic cases, I suppose. One of the things that came out at the time was they were supposed to issue a report on, I think it was June 25th. And I always associate that with the date of the Custer massacre. And this report was equally devastating, I guess. What it boiled down to is they had like 18 pages and it really said nothing. They were required by Congress to make a report, I think about a week or 10 days prior to the deadline. They realized they needed to do something because Congress was going to ask them questions. And they came up with this cockamamie report. So all of that wasn't very good and wasn't helpful at all. And then came this guy, David Grush, who I guess was a retired Air Force major, was an intelligence officer, served a tour in, I don't remember whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq. And I'm thinking, yeah, big deal. Who wasn't an Air Force intelligence officer at one time? But he was quizzed by reporters. He talked about 12 events, 12 crashes. But he really never gives much in the way of information. He mentioned too Roswell, which everybody knows about. There's no secret about what happened at Roswell. It's just the interpretation of the evidence that is in controversy. And I think I've talked to literally hundreds of people, officers who were there, enlisted men who were there, nurses. We interviewed some nurses who were there but really had no knowledge of what happened, or said they had no knowledge of what happened. We talked to an awful lot of people, civilians around the area, who had some involvement in it. Bill Brazel comes to mind immediately. He's the son of the rancher who found it, and talked about how he had been in the fields in the days and the years after the event and found, he said 10 to 12 pieces of material, and he described them to him. And it sounds like nothing you would have found in that environment at that time. One of them was, he described it as monofilament fishing line. You could shine a light in one end and it came out the other. Well, clearly he's talking about fiber optics. He's talking about this, what he called a little piece of wood that was light like balsa wood, had no really mass to it. And he wanted to see if there was any stratification in it. He tried to carve on it with his pocket knife to get a sliver, and couldn't do it. And then, of course, he talked about the aluminum foil material that you wad up in your hand, you drop it on the table, it would unfold itself. Clearly, this is nothing that existed in 1947. Pretty much nothing that exists today. So we talked to a lot of people, and Crush, of course, mentioned the Roswell case without giving any specifics. And then he mentioned this case from Italy in 1933, where Mussolini and the fascists in Italy had recovered some kind of a craft, and the United States eventually got their hands on it at the end of the Second World War, which may have been facilitated, according to the story, by the Catholic Church. Well, this makes no sense. I mean, I might be, if not the leading expert on UFO crashes, one of the top two. I've been and talked to many people about that. I've exposed some of those cases as being untrue. And I think of Robert Willingham, who clearly was not the Air Force officer he claimed to be. Grush, of course, was the Air Force officer he claimed to be. We don't want to make that mistake. But colleagues in Italy 20 years ago, 25 years ago, had heard about this story and investigated, and their conclusion was it was a hoax. Like the MJ-12 documents may have been inspired by the MJ-12 documents, in fact, the way it came into it. And they would look, they'd say, well, the documents or the information came from this archive in Italy, and they went there and the archive didn't exist, or the library didn't exist, or the documents they presented didn't provide enough information. The conclusion of the Italian investigators, and these are guys who want to believe that there's UFOs, want to believe there's alien visitation, or off-world visitation, as I think they say in one of the new reports, talk about the off-world technology. And they concluded it was a hoax. Now, if there was any inkling that there was something legitimate going on there, they would have been supporting it and looking into it. And I was astonished that Grush didn't know that. He talked about these other crashes. He talked about meeting the people who were involved, but he wouldn't give us any names. And I've said all along, well, Don Schmitt and Tom Carey and and Stan Friedman, when he was still alive, would give you names. You know, here's who was involved, from Colonel Blanchard to General Ramey to General Dubose to Edwin Easley to Jesse Marcel, to all these people who were directly involved and had direct knowledge, and we could prove it by their positions in Roswell in 1947. Jesse Marcel, we've got a picture of him in General Ramey's office with Dubose. So we could prove that sort of thing. But Grush would not provide any names, wouldn't provide any documentation. He said, well, I got it through secret sources. I think we could pretty well figure out what some of these cases are based on the history of research into UFO crashes. And I would bet money that Aztec would be one of them. I would bet money that Kecksburg would be one of them. I would bet money that Shag Harbor in Canada would have been one of them. With those cases, I think Shag Harbor has the best documentation and the best evidence. And Chris Stiles and Don Ledger in Canada have done a masterful job of gathering the documentation and the information about that crash. Although I think it was more of an emergency landing than a crash, because apparently it went into Shag Harbor. It was detected on the floor of the harbor there for a period of time, and eventually it disappeared. Apparently they repaired it and they got away in some fashion. Dark Skies, I think, or Dark Objects, something like that, by Don Ledger. For those who want to do get more in-depth information on that, would be a good place to start. But we can speculate about some of these crashes, and that would tell us a great deal about the credibility of David Grush and his sources. I think he's relating accurately what he's been told. I think the problem is some of those relating the information to him were not as credible as they could have been. And that's where we run into problems with an awful lot of the UFO investigations. We get somebody who seems to be highly credentialed, and they talk about these sorts of things. And then when we get into it in depth, we learn that, well, maybe not quite so much. I think of Robert Willingham, for example. And here's a guy that I believed. He said he was a retired Air Force colonel, said that he was involved in not exactly a retrieval operation, but he was around that operation at the time it went on. This object crossed the United States and crashed just over the border in Mexico, in the Del Rio area. And he said that he was flying an F-94 fighter at the time, and they picked it up on the radar, or the DEW line called him and told him about the object, and he landed at Dyess Air Force Base, got into one of the private planes. And most Air Force bases have an aero club on them where the pilots can rent Cessnas and things like that for additional flight time, or take the family on a flight or things like that. So he rented one of those planes, flew down and landed close by, saw the Mexican military retrieving the object, keeping it under wraps, and that sort of thing. And this all happened in, I want to say 1947. That might not be right. But anyway, that was like 47, 48, that time frame. Later, the date changed to 1950, then it changed to 1954. And we all believed him. He signed an affidavit. There was pictures of him in his Air Force uniform from the 1960s. And this is great evidence. The problem with the pictures, and it's something that I noticed, but apparently nobody else did. I'd been in the Civil Air Patrol as a teenager. They have an adult service and a cadet program. The Civil Air Patrol is an Air Force auxiliary, which means it's a bunch of civilians. I shouldn't say bunch, it's pilots and the like. And they are involved in search and rescue missions for the Air Force, active missions. It takes a burden off the Air Force. They make no money for it, except the Air Force pays for their fuel costs. So they get free flight time out of the deal. So it's a good thing for them. And the pictures of Willingham in his Air Force uniform turned out to be a CAP uniform. No question he was in the Civil Air Patrol. And I got to looking at those pictures and I said, this isn't right. I got his military record from St. Louis, showed he was been in the military for 13 months. He is a veteran of World War II, technically. He joined the service in December of 1947. No, 1945. He got out in January of 1947. He was in for about 13 months. The war was not declared officially over until the middle of 1946. So if you served after all the shooting started, prior to 1946, you get credit for service in World War II. I'm in a similar circumstance. I get credit for being involved in the Gulf War because I was in the Air Force Reserve at the time. I've never really mentioned that, and I was on the list to be called up to go to the Middle East when the war ended. But I got credit for being involved in the Gulf War in that way. I never deployed into a combat zone. So I've been involved, I guess, in 3 wars, you could say, 2 actively and 1 sort of bystander of that. But Willingham's testimony collapsed under scrutiny. It turned out that he wasn't telling the truth. And I fear that some of what Grush knows is the same sort of thing, that somebody talked about the Willingham case without knowing the full story. And he overheard it and he's now reporting it, but he doesn't give us the names. And without the names or the locations or the dates, there's really nothing we can do to vet that information. And we need to do that. And I don't think there's anything that he heard that would be highly classified, although he probably was told that and it may have assumed that. So we look at all of that sort of thing. But we have this mythology of UFO crashes, and some of the lists have 300 on them, starting back tens of thousands of years ago, and many more in the modern era. And I'm thinking if the UFOs are falling out of the sky at this rate, surely one of them would fall into a place where the military or the governments of the various countries couldn't have covered up. It would have fallen somewhere where the news media would have gotten to it. Think, for example, if the Roswell UFO, the Roswell object, had not fallen near Roswell, where the military kind of controlled the town. It's right after World War II, and the people are very cooperative. What if it had fallen close to New York City or Washington, D.C., and there was a lot of civilians who were involved and reporters and whatnot before the military could take it under wraps? Well, we'd be having a different discussion. So when I look at all of this stuff, and I've done 2 books on UFO crashes, one, Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, I think, which the better of the 2, simply because it covers more material. You can take a look at that and see how many of these stories are single witness. They don't make a lot of sense. There was a reported crash in Sweden in 1952 that's been reported many, many times, and actually military messages, classified messages, went through the communication centers at the time. It's now been found, and these are people in Scandinavia who were able to follow up on it, reporting on how it was a hoax started by someone. The newspapers didn't exist. The first story, it was a Russian craft of some kind as opposed to an alien spacecraft. So, I mean, that's kind of where we are. I will be back right after this, and we'll talk a little bit about more about the state of UFO research. So please stick around.
Are you interested in evolving with the times and becoming all you can be? Don't you wish there was one place to find the latest information to help guide you through the process? I'm Gwilda Wiyaka, host of Mission Evolution Radio TV. Join me on my mission to find the latest evolutionary knowledge and tools. The guests on Mission Evolution are leading experts in a wide variety of divergent topics, including allopathic, holistic, and integrative medicine, epigenetics, enlightenment, quantum physics, meditative practices, environmental issues, spiritual evolution, trauma healing, and so much more. Mission Evolution Radio TV is aired worldwide through the X-Zone Broadcast Network, X-Zone TV Channel 32 on Simul TV. You can enjoy our archives of radio or TV shows with our compliments at www.missionevolution.org. Come see the amazing lineup of guests and topics. With more than 200 episodes to choose from, you're sure to find what you're looking for. Visit www.missionevolution.org.
And I am back. I should probably say, for those of you interested, my blog carries an awful lot of this information. There's nearly 1,500 different entries on the blog about various aspects of UFOs and some other topics that kind of interested me at kevinrandle.blogspot.com. And there's a search engine on there. You plug in like APRO, and it'll bring up all the articles I've done about what's going on with APRO or David Grush or any of this latest stuff. And that kind of moves me into the final topic for this program here. And that's kind of the state of UFO research today. And we saw an awful lot of interest after Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal's articles were published in the New York Times. And we saw a lot of interest when David Grush came forward with his stories about what was going on. And that seems to have mitigated a little bit in recent weeks, recent months. It's not quite the fervor it once was. But we also got a glimpse of the investigations. And I bring this up because they've worked very hard to separate what we would think now is the modern era from the history of ufology, beginning back with the Foo Fighters of World War II. And they've changed the acronyms. UFO was out because it became too connected to alien spacecraft. Even though we all knew what it meant, unidentified flying object meant it was something that was unidentified. But you could say, yeah, but it said it was flying and it was an object, so it had its own implicit bias, I suppose. So we changed it to anomalous aerial phenomenon, unidentified anomalous aerial phenomenon, UAP. And they decided that they were going to look into some of the events where objects were seen falling into the ocean. So then it became unidentified anomalous phenomenon. But I think of that more as a way of separating UFOs from the current investigation and misdirecting people into what was really going on. And I've noticed they've changed a lot of the acronyms of the phenomenon as well, and to create that separation. So if you're looking for or looking at UAPs, you may not get into the UFO phenomenon or the flying saucers. Don Schmitt, Stan Friedman, and I once decided, and this was 30 years ago, that the problem with unidentified flying object as a descriptor for what was going on encompassed a lot of things that were not what we were interested in, which were basically alien spacecraft. So we were going to return to the term flying saucers. Those were alien spacecraft. That's the only definition you had for it, because we thought that was a better descriptor. I know that the Air Force, and Ed Ruppelt wrote about this in his book, the report on unidentified flying objects. He said that they didn't use the term flying saucers other than to ridicule the phenomenon by saying, well, you don't believe in those flying saucers, do you? So it took a back seat to UFOs. I think APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, used UAO or UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. No, object. He did UAO, unidentified aerial object. Well, that still implies something there. So we've moved away from that, and we get into this ridiculous idea of separating what's going on today with what was going on before. And I've always said, to understand today's environment, you need to understand what was going on before, because an awful lot of the information that was gathered or the investigations that were conducted at that time had one mission, and that was to ridicule the idea there was alien spacecraft. We go back again to the Washington National sightings of 1952, which spawned the Robertson panel. Here was a bunch of guys, eminent men in their fields, who got together in January of 1953 to see what evidence was available in the Project Blue Book files. Curiously, I think Ed Ruppelt and Alan Hynek were there for half a day. And they were going through all this material, and they decided that there was really nothing to it. Teachers should be discouraged from allowing students to do book reports on UFOs, on UFO books, or projects dealing with UFOs. They suggested to release sightings that seemed mysterious at first, but were later resolved as a way of discrediting UFO sightings, but it would be limited to that. We look at the Air Force regulations at the time. It said that if the object was identified, then the local authorities could release it to the news media. If not, then the local authorities had to pass that information, or pass the reporters up the chain of command to the Air Force Office of Public Information. So it gave it a whole different spin, that sort of thing. So you look at that sort of thing. The other interesting thing about the Robertson panel, like the Condon Committee, and Dr. Michael Swords pointed this out in a couple of articles, including in his book with Robert Powell, UFOs and Government, that the Robertson panel met for 5 days, Monday through Friday. And the Friday session apparently went a little bit long. The next morning, Robertson has the completed report. And Swords says, you just couldn't believe a guy like Robertson would go home and stay up late batting out this report. But not only had he written the report about what they had found, it had been endorsed or signed off by 2 of the other members. Clearly that report was written prior to the end of the meeting, the panel discussions. And clearly they had an agenda to pass along. And they were not interested in giving it a unbiased look. And we see this whole history through history of this sort of thing when we study the UFOs. And I think it's important that we all understand that sort of thing. And we wipe away this sort of thing, that you can wipe away the hoaxes, the known hoaxes. We don't need those. Yeah, there were hoaxes. There's no question about it. I often say that 99% of the UFO photographs taken back in the older era were taken by teenage boys, and 99% of those were faked. I did talk to Carl Hart Jr., who was 19 at the time. He took the pictures of the Lubbock Lights, which I know many of you have seen. There's 4 of them that were published. He took 5. The 5th one has disappeared, and I was never able to find out what happened to it. Hart didn't know either. But I talked to Carl Hart in 1994, 1995. He was in his 60s then. And we had seen in the past where the teenage boys had created the hoax, and later in life they came clean and said, yeah, we made that up. It was fake. So I'm talking to Hart about that, and I said, what did you photograph? And he says, I still don't know. So here's an opportunity. There's going to be no repercussions. If it was a hoax, he should tell us. He said, I still don't know. And I think that's an important thing to remember. But that sort of information gets lost in the attempts to belittle anybody who's involved in UFO research or have UFO sightings. There's some good photographs that should be examined and carefully examined out there. There's not a lot of them. Somebody asked me once, why are there no good UFO photographs today? Because everybody's carrying a really good camera around in their cell phones now. So they should get it. And a lot of times the sightings are too short for them to get the camera out and bring it into play. But often the camera malfunctions, which is an interesting sidelight to this. They say, well, I tried to get my camera out. It was stuck in some mode. I may have got a snapshot, or I couldn't get it to work, or the screen was showing the object. And when I went back to replay, everything was black except for the audio commentary and that sort of thing. And a lot of them are very short, and the objects are too far away for us to see anything other than a blob of light moving around in the sky. So you have all of that going on, and there's good investigations going on. But a friend of mine, Russ Estes, did a video of a UFO. It's really crummy looking video, and he did it on purpose to make it cartoonish, so it'd never be considered a real thing. But he put together an audio or a video of it with the audio commentary to show how easy it would be to fake something like that. And I think in today's environment, any 12-year-old kid can do it. I may not be able to do it, but a 12-year-old kid could do it. So we look at the state of UFO research. It's become more sophisticated. It's becoming better. Science is beginning to take a look at it, although they're hung up on this empirical observation as opposed to anecdotal observation, which doesn't explain a whole lot. But we see academic interest. Avi Loeb, for example, springs to mind immediately as being somebody who's interested in these, as they called it in the latest APRO report that just came, off-world objects. And I really like that term from Blade Runner, off-world. But we're getting nothing official other than the same things we've gotten for 70 years. Well, there's nothing to it. Witnesses may be exaggerating. We don't have enough data to follow up on it. All of this sort of thing. And then the last APRO report that came out just a few weeks ago, that's exactly what Dr. Kirkpatrick said is, well, there is no, evidence, empirical evidence, sort of mouthing the same thing that has been said for a long time. And what happened was the same thing that had happened previous. When the Condon Committee did their investigation, the reporters read the executive summary, maybe, but they looked at the conclusions. With this latest APRO report, and it goes 64 pages, and you can find it online. I think there's a link to it on my blog, as a matter of fact. And the conclusions say basically there's no empirical evidence of off-world visitation. And I'm thinking, yeah, with your qualification, that might be true, but that does not negate the possibility that there has been this sort of alien visitation. So they're using weasel wording language or dodging the question by going off on tangents and not really giving us a good look at what's going on and what they may know. Is there a national security aspect to it? There well could be, because one of the missions of the Air Force is to keep intruders out of our airspace, like the balloon that crossed the United States a while back. Their Air Force is to stop that. The Air Force's mission is to stop that sort of thing. So there are some national security aspects to it. But I think this idea that there's going to be transparency in the near future is probably not going to happen, and we can see where it is going. And I think APRO may have concluded their investigation, and it's been handed off to a NASA organization and maybe another organization to continue on. But we're not getting the sort of information we need. In my investigations, I will admit to I'll say off-world bias, just because I like the term. But I try to be dispassionate in the investigation. Here's what I found, regardless of where it takes me, good, bad, or indifferent. Here's what I found. And I try to bring that to the books that I've done. I looked at the Socorro landing, for example, and brought in a lot of other information about it, because I thought it was important to understand the whole case. You needed to understand that. And the same thing with the Roswell case. Here's what the government has said. Here's what some of the people involved said, what the skeptics have said. Here's where we are on that. I am not a fan of abductions, but I've done a book that's coming out soon called 1973, and it features the Pascagoula abduction. If there was an abduction case, this is probably the one. Not because there were 2 witnesses, but because there were other witnesses who saw the abduction contrary to what was been seen. And those names came out the day after the sighting. So it's not something that was confabulated later. So anyway, if you want more information, take a look at my books. They're mostly under Kevin Randle. If you're interested in my Vietnam experiences and that sort of thing, take a look at Eric Helm. And take a look at my blog at kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and I will return soon with more information. So thank you for tuning in.